Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. He may require the opinion, in writing, of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective office, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment.
The President of the United States of America faces many challenges, even at times of peace. When the U.S. is involved with a conflict, be it between America and another country, or intervening in a war abroad, the United States President, as outlined in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, assumes command of all branches of the military. While some presidents have chosen trusted military advisors in a time of conflict, still others throughout the history have almost taken matters into their own hands, with a select few even taking to the battlefield themselves. In addition to the duties and responsibilities held by the President during wartime, we shall also review the diplomatic and judiciary roles the President must fill as well, as we take a look at the President from politics to power.
Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. He shall have power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper, in the President alone, in the court of law, or in the heads of departments.
Article 2 continues with a system of checks and balances by allowing the President to appoint his official advisors, the principal officers of various executive departments. Thus, the Constitution creates the President's cabinet. Except in cases of impeachment, the President may grant pardons or reprieves of sentences. For example, the President may not pardon him or herself if they are the one being impeached. Until 1833, the Supreme Court ruled that the convict was allowed to reject the pardon. In the case of the United States versus Wilson, the defendant, George Wilson, was convicted of robbing the U.S. mail. Wilson's more influential friends held sway with President Andrew Jackson and were able to secure a pardon for Wilson. Wilson, however, refused the pardon, so the case was taken to the Supreme Court, who found that
a pardon is a deed to the validity of which delivery is essential, and delivery is not complete without acceptance. It may then be rejected by the person to whom it is tendered, and if it is rejected, we have discovered no power in this court to force it upon him. A pardon, in our days, is not a private act of grace from an individual happening to possess power. It is a part of the constitutional scheme.
Perhaps one of the most notorious pardons in recent memory was the pardon of exiting President Richard Nixon by his ascending vice president, Gerald Ford. Ford absolved Nixon of any wrongdoing for his involvement in official misconduct during what came to be known as the Watergate scandal. The president may grant a pardon at any time, and it is not required that a convict seek pardon or even charges to be filed. At the time of Nixon's resignation, Nixon only faced the threat of impeachment proceedings, and no conviction was levied against him. Nixon's pardon was not the only controversial presidential pardon in United States history. As Andrew Johnson was leaving office in 1868, he granted a pardon that would end all possibility of criminal proceedings against any former member of the Confederate Army not currently indicted. Later in the year, on Christmas Day, he extended the pardon to all former Confederates, including Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had been convicted in involvement with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, when he treated John Wilkes Booth's broken leg after the shooting. More recently, President Jimmy Carter caught some criticism for granting amnesty to Vietnam-era draft dodgers, and George H.W. Bush's decision to pardon 75 people, including Reagan administration officials involved in the Iran-Contra affair, also proved divisive. And Clinton's pardon of over 100 convicts included his own half-brother, Roger Clinton Jr., for cocaine possession, and billionaire fugitive for tax evasion, Mark Rich, which also was met with controversy. A symbolic gesture of the presidential pardon comes every year at the National Thanksgiving Turkey Presentation. Formally a tradition since 1989, the presidential pardon is granted to a live domestic turkey presented to the president by the National Turkey Federation and the Egg National Board Council. Some historians credit Harry Truman with creating the tradition. With their full pardons, many of the birds went on to live at Disneyland in California or Walt Disney World in Florida, where they served as the honorary grand marshals in the Thanksgiving Day Parade. Later, the pardoned turkeys were sent to live at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate and home. While the president serves as the commander-in-chief of the United States military, the powers to declare war rests in the hands of Congress, as made explicit by Article 1 of the United States Constitution. The president may speak on behalf of the United States when treaties are made, but again, 2/3 of the Senate must also approve the measure. Once the United States is at war, the president relies on his cabinet, specifically the Secretary of Defense and the heads of each branch of the military. But their expertise alone has not always guided a president during wartime. Many presidents have served in the military before becoming elected president. Indeed, some even had never held office or had little political experience. Ulysses S. Grant was one such figure. A career soldier, Grant only entered into politics after the Union victory in the Civil War.
As the United States is the freest of all nations, so too its people sympathize with all people struggling for liberty and self-government. But while so sympathizing, it is due to our honor that we should abstain from enforcing our views upon unwilling nations and from taking an interested part without invitation in the quarrels between different nations or between governments and their subjects. Our course should always be in conformity with strict justice and law, international and local.
After the war, Grant was a celebrity. He won the 1869 election by a landslide and presided over the first administration after slavery had been outlawed and citizenship granted to former slaves. The difficult Reconstruction period continued under Grant, who, while some opponents called him a butcher during the Civil War, managed to keep the United States out of war with compromises with the Brits and Spain. While his experience as a military tactician and perhaps his reputation as a ruthless general certainly paid off in much of his foreign policy dealings, Grant was ill-equipped to deal with an industrial depression brought on by the Panic of 1873. Noro Island. Commander. Native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Need small boat. Kennedy. That message was carved on a coconut and was to be the savior of 11 men in the Pacific theater of World War II. On August 2nd, 1943, between Arundel and Kolombangara in the Solomon Islands, the Japanese destroyer ship Amagiri moved swiftly in the night to avoid United States detection and ran down the motor torpedo boat PT-109. It is unknown whether the destroyer meant this course of action or if they simply did not see the United States Navy vessel in the dark waters. In any event, the crew of PT-109 had only 10 seconds to respond to the impending enemy vessel. 109, as well as PT-162 and PT-169, were patrolling the area in search of enemy ships when the Amagiri surprised them. After the boat struck PT-109, cutting it in half, PT-169 fired upon the Amagiri, missing it. Assuming the crew of PT-109 lost, 169 and 162 returned to base. In fact, only 2 crew members aboard PT-109 had been killed. The rest were led to the safety of a nearby island by their commander, a Harvard varsity swim team alumnus, Lieutenant, junior grade, John F. Kennedy. While president, JFK continued the intrepid spirit of the Navy by launching the Apollo space program, and he oversaw military action, both ill-fated and somewhat successful, like the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy also assigned a number of military advisors and special operation forces to Vietnam during the early stages of that conflict. While Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, his foreign policy was primarily focused on containing and combating communism. While the Cold War struggle with the USSR shaped many of Kennedy's military actions, JFK felt that the nations of the world should work towards peace. On March 1st, 1961, Kennedy issued Executive Order 10924, creating the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps have been active since 1961, with over 200,000 Americans serving in underdeveloped nations to help with education, farming, healthcare, and construction. In 2001, the United States' highest military honor was bestowed posthumously upon, to date, the only president of the United States to receive the commendation. Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Battle of San Juan Hill over 100 years prior. In the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, he hated being called Teddy, resigned from his post as Secretary of the Navy and formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, dubbed by the media as the Rough Riders. In Cuba, where many of the regiment had fallen to yellow fever, more so than to enemy bullets, Roosevelt led a brigade of bedraggled volunteers up Kettle Hill, through barbed wire, and San Juan Hill, taking San Juan Heights and proving to be a decisive battle in the war. After his military service and the love affair that the Rough Riders enjoyed with the press, Roosevelt was able to write his own ticket. Within a year of the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898, Roosevelt was elected governor of New York, and 2 years later, he was elected vice president to William McKinley. When McKinley died in office, Roosevelt ascended to the presidency and was re-elected in 1904. Like Grant, Roosevelt was another war hero who managed to keep the peace while in office. He was a key figure in the negotiation of the Russo-Japanese War, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, one of only 3 sitting presidents to achieve this honor. While a noted peacekeeper, Roosevelt was known to stress the importance of always being prepared for war should the situation arise. He was often quoted, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The first president of the United States, George Washington, became the first sitting president to lead troops in the field. This came amidst the Whiskey Rebellion from 1791 through 1794. George Washington, General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army during the American Revolution, dispatched both peace commissioners and militia forces into western Pennsylvania in order to quell an armed resistance to tax collectors who were enforcing a new tax on farmers who used their leftover corn and grain for the production of whiskey. About 20 men were captured, but the rebels dispersed before any confrontation occurred, with Washington riding to various fronts to be updated on progress of the expedition prior to the disbandment of the rebels. Washington led a significantly smaller army than he had during the Revolution, and a draft was instituted to rally men for the suppression of the rebels. Draft dodging was widespread, and there were challenges in recruiting for the militias, but clear advantages to the federal intervention of the rebellion, as General Daniel Morgan wrote to President Washington.
The business of recruiting was put off too late. Had it been in practice a week sooner, we could have engaged the number of men called for without difficulty. The pay will be an obstacle, and the clothing is not a sufficient inducement, or the people here don't like to wear that kind of clothing. Any number of cavalry could be raised here, but my opinion is that a great many more will be unnecessary for this service, as the alarm that these people have experienced is so great that they will never forget it, so far as to fly in the face of the law again. I am dealing very gently with them, and am becoming very popular, for which I am very happy.
Although the rebels disbanded and the whiskey tax remained difficult to collect, the incident marked the first time that the federal government demonstrated its power and willingness to suppress uprising through military action. In his last day in office, Washington granted the first federal pardon to those who led the Whiskey Rebellion. By the time John Adams came into power as the second United States president, it appeared war with the new Republic of France would be unavoidable. With much diplomatic experience but little military expertise, the second president of the United States was faced with a daunting challenge.
I desire no other inscription over my gravestone than, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of the peace with France in the year 1800.
America's second president, John Adams, rightfully requested that epitaph. Keeping the peace with France was no short order, and from early in Adams' administration, he and his diplomats worked tirelessly to continue Washington's policy: keep the United States uninvolved in wars in Europe. In 1797, Adams dispatched a commission to France, consisting of diplomats Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry. Their aim was to establish relations with the new French Republic, which had come to power as a result of the French Revolution in 1789. When French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord sent his agents to an informal negotiation with the American diplomats, they demanded bribes and a substantial loan from the Americans before any official talks were to begin. While this kind of demand was not uncommon in Europe at the time, Pinckney and Marshall were offended and soon left France. In a letter to Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, Pinckney stated their response to the French diplomats' demand for a tribute or a bribe.
No, not a sixpence.
Gerry stayed behind and continued the negotiations, but soon those talks too broke down. As Gerry continued his negotiations in France, Adams, with his cabinet, deliberated on just what course of action to take in the event of the diplomatic commission's failure. Adams' advisors sought to raise an army of 20,000 men and the purchase or fabrication of naval ships. As it appeared that negotiations failed, Many in Congress called for declarations of war with France. Adams addressed Congress and continued to urge for peace with the nation.
It is my sincere desire, and in this I presume I concur with you and with our constituents, to preserve peace and friendship with all nations, and believing that neither the honor nor the interest of the United States absolutely forbid the repetition of advances for securing these desirable objects with France, I shall institute a fresh attempt at negotiation, and shall not fail to promote and accelerate an accommodation on terms compatible with the rights, duties, interests, and honor of the nation. If we have committed errors and these can be demonstrated, we shall be willing on conviction to redress them, and equal measures of justice we have a right to expect from France and every other nation. While we are endeavoring to adjust all our differences with France by amicable negotiation, the progress of the war in Europe, the depredations on our commerce, the personal injuries to our citizens, and the general complexion of affairs render it my indispensable duty to recommend to your consideration effectual measures of defense. The commerce of the United States has become an interesting object of attention, whether we consider it in relation to the wealth and finances or the strength and resources of the nation. With the seacoast of near 2,000 miles in extent, opening a wide field for fisheries, navigation, and commerce, a great portion of our citizens naturally apply their industry and enterprise to these objects. Any serious and permanent injury to commerce would not fail to produce the most embarrassing disorders. To prevent it from being undermined and destroyed, it is essential that it receive an adequate protection.
The dispatch's release incited further fury and more calls for war. Adams refused to ask Congress for an official declaration. While Adams had no military background, he was fully aware that an all-out war with France would leave the United States severely outmatched and would probably result in a loss. While an official declaration of war never came, Congress annulled the Treaty of Alliance of 1778 and authorized attacks on French warships, with most of the fighting taking place in the Caribbean. The quasi-war, as it came to be known, only came to an end with the Treaty of Mortefontaine, taking place between Adams' Secretary of State John Marshall and Napoleon Bonaparte. The agreement was ratified by the United States Senate in December of 1801. While many presidents have either served during wartime as a soldier, commander, or diplomat, still others were forced into a sort of trial by fire, as just 11 years later, the United States, led by President James Madison, would soon find itself back at war with their old oppressors.
We behold, in fine, on the side of Great Britain, a state of war against the United States, and on the side of the United States, a state of peace toward Great Britain. Whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations and these accumulating wrongs, or, opposing force to force in defense of their national rights, shall commit a just cause into the hands of the almighty disposer of events, avoiding all connections which might entangle it in the contest or views of other powers, and preserving a constant readiness to concur in an honorable reestablishment of peace and friendship, is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. In recommending it to their early deliberations, I am happy in the assurance that the decision will be worthy the enlightened and patriotic counsels of a virtuous, a free, and a powerful nation.
Prior to the War of 1812, President James Madison had spent his first 3 years in office dismantling the system put into place by the Federalist Party, devised by Alexander Hamilton, and implemented by former Presidents Washington and Adams. Madison and prior President Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party distrusted a national bank as well as a standing army. Still, as Britain armed Indian tribes in the Northeast and Royal Navy ships continued to capture American vessels on the high seas, the citizens of the United States cried for British blood and elected a war hawk Congress, all too eager to engage in combat with their former oppressors. Soon, Madison had no choice but to ask Congress for a formal declaration of war.
Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that war be and is hereby declared to exist between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the dependencies thereof, and the United States of America and their territories, and that the President of the United States is hereby authorized to use the whole land and naval force of the United States to carry the same into effect, and to issue to private armed vessels of the United States commissions, or letters of marque and general reprisal, in such form as he shall think proper, and under the seal of the United States, against the vessels, goods, and effects of the government of the said United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the subjects thereof.
When war was finally upon them, the United States had only poorly trained state militias to rely on. Madison, believing that British-controlled Canada could easily be overthrown by militias in the Northeast states, was soon shocked to learn that many governors in that region either didn't allow their militias to leave the state or ordered the men to sit the war out altogether. Soon America found itself at war again on its own soil. Fighting raged in the Great Lakes with the Canadians, in the southern states with the Creek Indians, and on the Atlantic Ocean with the British Royal Navy. Madison's militia in Washington just barely escaped before the city and the White House was burned almost completely to the ground. But American warships, thanks to a rebuilt shipyard in Sackett's Harbor, New York, won decisive battles on the Great Lakes, and American merchant ships were authorized as privateers by Madison, resulting in the capture of 1,800 British ships. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war in February of 1815, and though no territory was lost or gained on either side, popular memory of the war is one of American victory, owing to the impossible odds, and perhaps most famously for the Star-Spangled Banner, a poem written by Francis Scott Key, inspired by the defense of Fort McKinley. While the battle ended in a draw, the American people saw it as a victory and elected Madison for a second term. The conflict taught the president and the country about the importance of a standing military, even at peacetime. New ships were built, and Congress passed an act for the gradual increase of the Navy to spend $1 million a year for 8 years for the purpose of building 9 ships and 12 heavy frigates. The psychological toll that weighed on Abraham Lincoln as he made his first inaugural address must have been nearly too much for any man to bear. He was a figure that had, through his election, almost ensured that the United States would soon be divided in civil war.
In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
As Lincoln was elected in the election of 1860, South Carolina formally announced its secession. By the following February, 6 more states followed, adopting a new constitution and declaring themselves the Confederate States of America. That same month, Allan Pinkerton, founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, was hired to ensure the president-elect's safe passage through Baltimore, Maryland, on his way to the inauguration. Allegedly, a conspiracy existed to kill Lincoln on a whistle-stop tour in Baltimore. The plan apparently was for several members of the crowd at President Street Station to be armed with knives, and when the president switched rail cars, someone would be close enough to kill him. Thanks to Pinkerton, Lincoln made it to Washington unscathed and took the oath of office on March 4, 1861. The following month, Lincoln faced what would become the signal that began the American Civil War. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, was under siege by the newly formed Confederate Army, and the first general officer, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard. South Carolina Governor Francis W. Pickens demanded that the U.S. Army leave the installation, but Major Robert Anderson refused and notified the governor that he was sending to President Lincoln for supply ships. When Lincoln authorized the aid to the besieged fort, the Confederates took this act as one of war on the Southern secessionists. If Confederates and conspirators watched Lincoln's every move, so too did his political enemies. Once the war was over, many in his own party favored harsh consequences for Confederates, while Democrats called for compromise. Every decision made by Lincoln was painstakingly scrutinized, as the abolishment of slavery, a central issue in the American Civil War, shaped Lincoln's policy and platform. The pressures faced by Lincoln during Reconstruction, even coming from those who would be his allies, took a heavy toll on him. Nonetheless, Lincoln managed to be re-elected in 1864, and when he delivered his second inaugural speech, he offered a glimpse into his thoughts on the war.
On the occasion corresponding to this, 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came.
By 1895, conflict in Cuba had arisen against Spanish colonial rulers, and the United States people naturally favored the rebels. President William McKinley echoed the outrage of the American citizens at the cruel reprisals by the Spanish against the people of Cuba, which included placing Cubans in internment camps near Spanish military bases. Initially, McKinley sought peaceful compromise and began negotiations with Spain in 1897. But when the USS Maine, en route to Cuba to protect American lives and property, was sunk by an underwater mine, and Spain continued to refuse any concessions to the Cuban people, McKinley, without asking for a formal declaration of war, turned the matter over to Congress to decide how best to proceed.
The existing conditions cannot but fill this government and the American people with the gravest apprehension. There is no desire on the part of our people to profit by the misfortunes of Spain. We have only the desire to see the Cubans prosperous and contented, enjoying that measure of self-control which is the inalienable right of man, protected in their right to reap the benefits of the exhaustless treasures of their country. The offer made by my predecessor in April 1896, tendering the friendly offices of this government, failed. Any mediation on our part was not accepted. In brief, the answer read, There is no effectual way to pacify Cuba unless it begins with the actual submission of the rebels to the mother country. Then only could Spain act in the promised direction, of her own motion and after her own plans. The cruel policy of concentration was initiated February 16, 1896. The productive districts controlled by the Spanish armies were depopulated. The agricultural inhabitants were herded in and about the garrison towns, their lands laid waste and their dwellings destroyed. This policy the late Cabinet of Spain justified as a necessary measure of war and as a means of cutting off supplies from the insurgents. It has utterly failed as a war measure. It was not civilized warfare, it was extermination.
Advances in telephone and telegraph technologies at the time made McKinley's job as commander-in-chief a little easier, as day-to-day communication was even more instantaneous. While the technology advanced, it was still problematic to transmit commands to the Philippines, where U.S. naval forces, led by Commander George Dewey aboard the USS Olympia, fought Spanish squadrons in the Pacific Theater. When American forces overtook the Spanish in the Battle of Manila, the commanders there were unaware that a ceasefire had been signed between the U.S. and Spain on August 12, 1899. The following day, the United States captured Manila, an action deeply resented by the Filipino rebel forces also vying for the city. This later led to the Philippine-American War, as the United States and Filipino rebels then vied for control of the region.
The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. Those responsible for exciting it will assume a heavy responsibility for no less a thing than that the people of the United States, whose love of their country and whose loyalty to its government should unite them as Americans, all bound in honor and affection to think first of her and her interests, may be divided in camps of hostile opinion, hot against each other, involved in the war itself in impulse and opinion, if not in action. I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepest, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality, which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides.
President Woodrow Wilson spent the years of 1914 through 1917, during his first term in office, fighting tooth and nail to keep the United States out of the Great War in Europe, what would later come to be known as World War I. In his early stance, Wilson urged Congress and the citizens of the United States not to take sides in the war and refused to build a standing army for possible defense or entry into the war. These actions drew criticism from Republicans, led by former President Theodore Roosevelt, as it became clear that the Germans were ignoring Wilson's demand for an end to German submarine attacks on civilian ships. Even after a narrow re-election on the "He kept us out of the war" slogan, and the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, resulting in the loss of 128 American lives and a total loss of 1,195 lives, Wilson and the United States maintained neutrality. After Germany instituted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the United States intercepted the Zimmerman telegram, a coded message that U.S. codebreakers revealed to be an attempt by the Germans to ally with the Mexicans against America, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany on April 2nd, 1917.
I am not now thinking of the loss of property involved, immense and serious as that is, but only of the wanton and wholesale destruction of the lives of non-combatants, men, women, and children, engaged in pursuits which have always, even in the darkest periods of modern history, been deemed innocent and legitimate. Property can be paid for. The lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. American ships have been sunk. American lives taken in ways which it has stirred us very deeply to learn of, but the ships and people of other neutral and friendly nations have been sunk and overwhelmed in the waters in the same way. There has been no discrimination. The challenge is to all mankind, with a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking. I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States. That it formally accept the status of belligerent, which has thus been thrust upon it.
After the declaration passed on April 6, 1917, Wilson handed command of the military to General John J. Pershing, who became the only person to be promoted in his lifetime to the highest rank ever held in the U.S. Army, General of the Armies. Wilson gave Pershing complete control of the military actions during the war, including strategy and even diplomacy. Back home, having all but relinquished control of the military to Pershing, Wilson pushed laws through Congress designed to suppress anti-British, pro-German, or anti-war opinion. Under Wilson, the first Western Propaganda Office, the U.S. Committee on Public Information, was formed. Its aim, to spread patriotism and anti-German sentiment to the masses. The committee also conducted acts of censorship, as the new laws saw some people jailed for criticizing the government or Wilson, and any newspaper or periodical that spoke against U.S. policy was banned from the U.S. mail system. While Wilson implemented oppressive and, some argued, unconstitutional edicts on the home front, General Pershing and the Allies were able to end the fighting in Europe in just under a year. If America had to be pushed into World War I, 1941 and President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw America thrown headlong into World War II.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace.
Any anti-war sentiment that had existed in 1941 quickly vanished after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 days after the strike, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States as well, and President Roosevelt found himself with his advisors commanding a war on several fronts. While the goal of crushing Nazi Germany from two sides in Europe and blocking their advances in the USSR and North Africa were there from the beginning, public opinion gave priority to the Pacific theater and the defeat of Japan. Roosevelt's strategy from the home front was to put the right people into the right role. He named Admiral Ernest J. King his chief of naval operations who commanded both the Navy and Marine forces, while General George C. Marshall was given command of the Army and Air Force in name only. General Hap Arnold commanded the Air Force in practice. In addition to the new command structure, Roosevelt created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a selection of advisors to the President and the Secretary of Defense, made up of senior officers from the Department of Defense, then called the Department of War, that became responsible for the final decisions regarding American military strategy. Unlike Wilson, who gave his commanders carte blanche, Roosevelt and his cabinet consulted with the Joint Chiefs, and the Americans met with their equivalents in Britain to form the combined Chiefs of Staff. While the President worked closely with his Joint Chiefs, no civilians were allowed to weigh in on strategy meetings, including Secretaries of War or the Navy. To destroy the Axis powers, Roosevelt also cooperated and consulted with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to develop a strategy that would end the German and Japanese reign of terror. Though Roosevelt died before completing his final term, and before the war was over, the United States' entry into World War II had already proven beneficial to the American economy, which in 1941 was still in the midst of the Great Depression. Manufacturing, spurred by munitions and other war front requirements, had already begun to lift the country's spirit, in addition to the country's bank balance. Roosevelt's final running mate and vice president, Harry S. Truman, would face a daunting challenge and a heavy responsibility with the end of World War II.
16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor, and they have been repaid many-fold. And the end is not yet. We are prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
When FDR passed away and his vice president Harry S. Truman assumed office, it was only a matter of weeks before the Germans surrendered in Europe. The war with Japan, however, was expected to drag on for at least another year. Truman insisted that Roosevelt's cabinet remain in place, but with one caveat. Truman would consult with what was now his cabinet, but it would be the president making the ultimate decision. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson told Truman of the atomic bomb, Truman knew he might have a way to end World War II in the Pacific. In August of 1945, Truman authorized the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. The strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain to this day the only use of nuclear weapons against an enemy country during wartime. With Truman in control and his cabinet and Joint Chiefs seemingly relegated to more advisory than authoritarian positions, in 1950, the president made the decision, without asking Congress, to authorize war against Korea. Truman felt that Congress mostly favored the war, so he decided formal authorization from Congress would not be necessary. The move harshly divided Congress, and later, Truman's political opposition named the Korean conflict as Mr. Truman's War. The Truman Doctrine, however, gained the support of both sides of the political aisle. The doctrine was a policy of communist containment that eventually led the United States into the Korean War. When it became clear that the Korean conflict could lead to a full-scale war with the Soviet Union, General Douglas MacArthur's strategy to attack Chinese bases supplying Korea with Red Chinese and Soviet weapons and warplanes clashed with Truman's wishes to avoid that kind of potentially catastrophic conflict. When Truman dismissed MacArthur, he sealed his political fate. His approval rate among the American people plummeted, Gallup polls reporting them at 22%. Though an unpopular decision, Truman stood by his decision to fire MacArthur, later telling a reporter,
"I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. That's the answer to that. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. But that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail."
3 years before the start of the war in Korea, another part of Truman's Cold War strategy took shape. The National Security Act of 1947 was a measure taken to merge the Departments of War and the Navy into a single body, the National Military Establishment, later renamed the Department of Defense, officially creating the U.S. Air Force and establishing the Central Intelligence Agency, the nation's first peacetime intelligence organization. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, originally a creation of FDR during World War II, was also established in the Act, which named the position as Chief of Staff of the Army, Naval Operations, Air Force, and later the Commandant of the Marine Corps. An act to promote the national security by providing for a Secretary of Defense, for a national military establishment, for a Department of the Army, a Department of the Navy, a Department of the Air Force, and for the coordination of the activities of the national military establishment with other departments and agencies of the government concerned with the national security, July 26, 1947. As of this writing, United States President Barack Obama has withdrawn American troops from Iraq and has set into motion a plan for withdrawing most of them from Afghanistan as well. How will the office of United States President continue to evolve? And what new duties and responsibilities will the President of the future face? At war or at peace, the job of the President of the United States of America is a tough one, but it's not without its perks and amenities. The buildings, institutions, and staff members that are required for the President to carry out his duties are each integral parts of a machine that is the presidential administration. In our next episode, we will examine the people and the parts that make the business of being president a successful one. Join us once again in our continuing look at the presidents, from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.